In modern-day Louisiana, there is a place with a dispiriting name, Poverty Point. With its plush green lawns, the site looks kind of like a golf course. Grass-covered mounds and ridges rise neatly in front of the carefully tended meadows, forming concentric rings that suddenly vanish near a slow-moving bayou about 15 miles from the Mississippi River. These are the remains of massive earthworks erected by Native Americans 3,600 years ago. Despite nature's best efforts to obliterate these earthworks and early European settlers' best efforts to deny their obvious significance, they endure. Poverty Point's earthworks are evidence of an ancient civilization of the lower Mississippi and a testimony to the scale of its accomplishments. The site is so big, it is best observed from high above. It's as if they are meant to invite the heavens to witness to the presence of their gathering. From high above in the air, Poverty Point looks like a giant amphitheater where a place of great crowds would gather, worthy of a great agrarian civilization. Except they were not farmers at all. They were hunters, fishers, and foragers. They relied on a superabundance of wild resources that was all around them. I'm summarizing here from anthropologist David Graeber and archaeologist David Wengrow's excellent book, The Dawn of Everything, A New Human History, and we'll continue to pull heavily from that book. The ancient people of Poverty Point may have known about agriculture, but chose not to use it. Why terrace, fertilize, and weed until when nature is providing you with so much food already? Now, the fact that you can have a highly complex civilization without agriculture may not blow your mind, but it did blow my mind. I used to think that you needed an all-powerful king to construct large public architecture. You see, growing up, one of the stories that captivated me was the creation story from Genesis and the Garden of Eden story. Those stories get at the fundamental questions of existence. Who are we and where did we come from? These stories are just embedded in Western civilization and culture. But by my early 20s, these stories stopped working, and I wanted to know where we really came from. And a new myth began to emerge and fascinate me. Now, I never formally studied anthropology or archaeology, but in my undergraduate studies, the professors and the books I read had basic assumptions about how we humanity got to where we are now. And the evolutionary story may sound familiar to you. It goes something like this. Once upon a time, humanity was made up of all hunter-gatherers living in basic small familial bands. They were egalitarian by default, happy and free. There was minimal division of labor without any formal political roles. Or, depending on your take, they lived short, miserable lives. Eventually, these small bands formed much larger tribes that did cultivate some plants, but didn't plow or use large irrigation systems. Eventually, chiefdoms created formal divisions of labor, and a heavy use of agriculture began. This allowed for the excess production of food. Since people don't have to constantly worry about calories, they could specialize in crafts and professions. People started living longer and had more children. The population grew. Because of agriculture, they could settle in one place and didn't have to keep traveling around for food. Cities emerged which needed kings to rule them, warriors to defend them, priests to lead them in ritual, scribes to record things, and bureaucrats to administer things. Eventually, art, philosophy begins to flourish. Civilization, as we know it, is born. Science eventually saves us from the miserable short lives, along with intense serial agriculture, a legal monopoly on the use of force, private property, professional administration, and a complex division of labor. Thus, then you get to us, democratic, industrialized nations, the pinnacle of humanity. Does this story sound familiar to some people? Or depending on your take on things, we may have less freedom, more patriarchy, huge disparities in wealth, and annoying bureaucrats demanding that we spend much of our lives filling out forms. If you've ever been to the DMV, you know what I'm talking about. This creation of civilization is all hinged on agriculture. It is almost as if agriculture is humanity's greatest triumph or its worst mistake. There are probably no archaeologists or anthropologists who adhere to this cultural progress story anymore. But that doesn't stop historians, theologians, and other ordinary folk like us to answer how we got to where we are with those progress evolutionary stories. It's difficult to think of history without it serving the current moment that we are in. There is a theological bias. We tend to think the whole of history had some design and purpose to bring us to this time and place. But our current arrangements are not inevitable. Things don't have to be the way they are. Besides this cultural evolution myth that brought us to industrialized capitalistic nation states is not what archaeological evidence points to. Okay, so let's take a journey back to the Garden of Eden. Because of Protestantism's influence, it's almost impossible to understand that story without seeing it as the first sin and the punishment. But I think it's first and foremost a maturation story, a journey from a dreaming innocence to wisdom, to knowledge of good and evil. Children aren't embarrassed of their nudity. Adults are. Well, at least most are. But it is hard not to talk about the beginnings of humanity without the Garden of Eden story. It's so fundamental and foundational to Western thinking. God tells and curses Adam, basically, to till the soil. Adam and Eve's children are Cain, a farmer, and Abel, a shepherd. Western thinkers, no doubt, influenced by this Garden of Eden story, thought of hunter-gatherers as being in a state of nature, of dreaming innocence, a pre-fall Garden of Eden bliss full of freedom, egalitarian attitudes, and a lack of hierarchy. Others might say they were poor and brutish. Either way, this is the ideology of the colonizers and settlers. They saw hunter-gatherers as different and other than, and they used this ideology as rationale to steal land. It goes something like this. Foragers obtain their needs and wants pretty easily with freedom and community and nature. But for colonizers, blissful, innocent, childlike creatures have no rights to land. Foraging people are living in a state of pre-civilization. They were deemed part of the land and had no legal claim to it. Colonizers thought they weren't really working and improving the land. Possession of land needs agriculture and cattle, they thought. Highly influential to the US founding patriarchs, philosopher John Locke said, when working the land, one mixes one labor with the land, and the land becomes part of oneself, something you can own. This way of thinking leads to indigenous people as being lazy, a racist meme that is still prevalent to this day. With this legal argument in hand, Europeans stole land in Australia, New Zealand, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas, which, by the way, often included rape, torture, enslavement, and mass murder. Thus, lands used for hunting and gathering were considered vacant. If indigenous people fight for their right to use their hunting land, they would be punished and subdued. And guess what? The land we live on right here, right now, was Mohawk hunting land. Now, I had not heard of Poverty Point until a few months ago, until I read this book, The Dawn of Everything. I questioned, why has this never been talked about before? Well, Poverty Point goes against the mythological progress of civilization. You can have complex civilization without agriculture and without kings. Thousands of people were involved to create Poverty Point's earthworks. Trade may have been different than we think of it now. But there is evidence of materials there from as far away as the Great Lakes. And they've recovered over 8,000 handcrafted arrows and spearheads. But it was a culture that also used sacred geometry linked to the calendar and the movement of celestial bodies. Poverty Point included rituals, vision quests, songs, dances, and images. Ancient foragers were exchanging complex information based on standard units of measurement. Proportions and configurations were shared. Calculus was used. Triangles measured with cords and strings. Foragers were not simple people. The lack of agriculture did not stop them from being complex, intelligent, artistic, and highly organized. There is no way to know this for sure, but the evidence points that they shared their understanding of cosmology, geology, philosophy, medicine, ethics, fauna, flora, and ideas without the written word. And of course, there are other large earthen works across North America. One, Watson Brake, which is older than the pyramids in Egypt and Stonehenge. Non-agrarian cultures are sometimes called archaic or primitive. These have become derogatory terms and date back, as far as I can tell, to the colonial era. The assumption was that the artistic expression and philosophical thought came to Europe eventually from civilizations of the Fertile Crescent. But this is not what the archaeological record is showing us. For example, a big wooden idol was found in a bog in the Urals that dates back to over 10,000 years ago. Forager monuments, large and small, are beautiful, artistic forager monuments are being found, large and small, across the globe. Cereal agriculture and monarchy was not inevitable. It is not inevitable that once rice, corn, or wheat is produced, an overlord will necessarily swoop in and administer things. Property ownership, state-sanctioned violence, classism, ruling elites, patriarchy, they are not inevitable. It's not that you just invent agriculture, cities, and writing, then all of a sudden you'll get Assyrian charioteers, Confucian bureaucracy, Inca sun kings, and Aztec priests. It just so happens we know more about those civilizations. The archaeological evidence is pretty clear that the first farmers were reluctant farmers. The process is far messier than we could have ever imagined. And farming didn't necessarily go in one direction. Native American history shows us that they went back and forth between corn, squash, beans, and sunflower, and foraging. And the indigenous people in California largely rejected agriculture, though they knew about it. Post-Ice Age, when humans began living around the world, flora and fauna flourished, as did foraging. And when foraging flourished, farming came naturally after. But in between, there was sort of this play farming, cultivating some crops without being full-time farmers. Maybe flood retreat farming near lakes and rivers happened first, maybe corralling some animals in semi-wild states, perhaps. In Europe, farming takes over. Population increased as we might expect, but then there were periods of busts and population declines. Corn was developed over 9,000 years ago, but doesn't become a major staple until 5,000 years after it is invented. Seed crops are introduced to the eastern woodlands around here about 3000 BC, but serious farming doesn't start here until 1000 AD. Early cultivation was simply seasonal complements to foraging, and early farmers had mixed success. It was invented largely where other gatherings, where foraging was thin, where there was nothing else to live on. There is so much we do not know about the dawn of everything. But we can safely say this: humanity is one. We have and have always been prone to creative thinking, artistic, religious, and communal endeavors. There are no primitive or archaic people. There are just people. Everything in history did not necessarily lead us to this point. The current structures of our global civilization do not have to be the way that they are. There is a mystery and riddle to all of this. We are constantly coming out of a dreaming innocence into good and evil, constantly coming out of the garden into wisdom and new knowledge. Though it is tempting to think we may arrive at some fertile plateau of greatness, we are not progressing to some elevated stage of human history. We are, like every generation before us, learning to walk. But we can choose our own stories. We can come from that fire of dawn and turn the world around. We are of the Spirit, always have, and always will be. And only people of the Spirit can turn the world around. In the words of Harry Belafonte, all of us are here for a very, very short time. And in that time that we are here, there really isn't any difference in any of us if we take time to understand each other. And the question is, do I know who you are? Do you know who I am? Do we care about each other? Because if we do, together, we can turn the world around.